Hi everybody, welcome to this new biology video. In this video, I want to talk about topics and concepts that are in textbook sections 13.3 and 13.4. So in this video, we highlight the second ecological principle for our ecology unit, and that is that all organisms have a source of energy. Now, this bird that you see here is an anhinga, and it inhabits tropical areas of North America, and it's going after this fish, and that is undoubtedly its food source and its energy source. And of course, the fish has an energy source as well, and even the lily pads there in the photograph have an energy source as well. So life thrives on energy, life needs energy, and all organisms have a specific source of energy. And in ecology, we need to understand what that energy source is, where the energy is coming from, and eventually what the organisms are doing with that energy. So at the base of every food chain are producers. These are organisms that get their energy from non-living sources. And sometimes we call these organisms autotrophs. They are self-feeding. Auto meaning self, and troph meaning to feed. And so we usually think of photosynthetic plants in this category because the plants were taught in elementary and middle school that they feed themselves. They're making their own energy with the help of the sun, and that's what makes them photosynthetic. But there are also some bacteria that can do this as well, be photosynthetic. They're called cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, and they occur in a variety of aquatic habitats. But they do the exact same photosynthesis that the plants that we're more familiar with also do. So remember, those are producers, and we also call them autotrophs. I might say that the word producer and autotroph are synonyms for our ecology unit. And then, of course, in all ecological settings, we have consumers. These are organisms that get their energy by eating other organisms. So typically we think of animals, but they're not the only organisms that do this. And we call these organisms heterotroph. Hetero means different, meaning that the organism has to go eat a different kind of organism in order to get the energy that it needs. And consumers are different than producers because consumers have to get their food from other organisms, where producers, for example the plants, actually make their own energy source. And it's interesting to note that autotrophs don't have to be just photosynthetic. They can actually be chemosynthetic. So the type of bacteria that live in this hot spring in Yellowstone are a special kind of bacteria. They can actually take the chemicals that are in the water, for example, hydrogen sulfide or methane, and actually use that to create their own energy source. So it's like using the sun in the case of the photosynthetic plants, but instead of using the sun, they're using another energy source, the energy source that's contained within some of these molecules that are found in these hot springs. And so we call them chemosynthetic bacteria because they're using the chemicals to synthesize their energy source, just like we call plants photosynthetic organisms because they're using light. That's what photo means in photosynthesis. So autotrophs can be either photosynthetic or they can be chemosynthetic. And it's important to realize that the producers are at the base of the food chain. They're providing the energy for all the other organisms, or in other words, all the other consumers in the ecosystem. So the plants use, for example, the sunlight as their energy source, but contained within the cells of plants and other autotrophs or other producers is an energy source that other organisms can use for their energy source. So this wasp is eating the pollen, which has some nutrients in it that, of course, the plant makes. The fungus, the mushroom, actually decomposes the dead and decaying parts of plants. And then, of course, we know that herbivores, for example, this tortoise here and the manatee, are actually eating the plants themselves, getting the energy that's stored within the plants. So producers provide the energy for all other organisms, and that's what makes them the base of the food chain for all ecosystems, or most ecosystems. And of course, a food chain is simply a model that shows the sequence of the feeding relationships. Remember, in ecology, we're interested in the relationships between organisms and their environment, and one of these relationships is the feeding relationship. So in this case, the grass is fed on by the rabbit, and the rabbit is fed upon by the hawk, and that's a food chain. So in a food chain, we can have different types of organisms occupying different places within that food chain. So we know that herbivores are things that eat plants mostly, and so again, the tortoise or maybe this beetle here are eating plant material. They're feeding directly upon the plants. And of course, the carnivores are eating other animals, and so they're eating an animal that at one point also ate a plant. And so you can see how the feeding relationships get a little bit more complex here. Now, don't forget that spiders are predators too, and carnivores too. We typically don't think of something that eats an insect as being a carnivore, but remember, a carnivore doesn't necessarily mean meat. It simply means eating another animal or eating another, I guess animals are eating other animals, and that's what we call a carnivore. Now, we can also have omnivores, and I think you know this term as well. For example, the bird and the gorilla here are omnivores. They're eating both animals. For example, the gorilla periodically eats insects that it finds in the forest. Same thing with the bird. The bird is going to eat seeds and other pieces of the plants in its environment, but it's also going to eat insects and maybe some worms and things like that from the environment. So it's eating animals and it's eating plant material in the ecosystem. There are also two other levels of consumers in our ecosystems. There are detritivores. They are eating dead and decaying material. So the roly-poly bug and the millipede here are sort of roaming around the forest eating dead and decaying material. They're not going after live food items. They're waiting for the organisms to die, and then they feed upon them after that. And decomposers are similar. For example, most fungi are decomposers, and they also feed on dead and decaying organisms, but they have a little bit different process. They actually have to digest and change and break down the dead and decaying material into its component chemicals, and then the fungi simply absorb those chemicals. So the difference between a decomposer and a detritivore is a very small difference. But remember, detritivores are actually eating the dead and decaying organisms directly, and the decomposers actually have to change the dead and decaying material chemically before they can actually absorb it and use it as an energy source. But they're still consumers, even though they're not eating organisms that are alive. So in ecology, when we speak about food chains and different feeding relationships, we use the term trophic level. And the trophic level that an organism occupies simply tells us where in the food chain it exists and where it gets its energy. For example, most producers in most ecosystems are photosynthetic plants. They form the base of the food chain. And primary consumers feed upon those plants or feed upon those producers. For example, this insect is feeding on the plant. And then a secondary consumer is an organism that's going to feed upon a primary consumer. So this chameleon is feeding on the insect, and the insect fed on the plant. So you can see how the relationships go here in the trophic levels. And then, of course, we can have a tertiary consumer, which is one more level up. For example, this snake is eating the lizard. The lizard ate the insect, and the insect ate the plant. And the plant was a producer at the base of the whole food chain. So trophic levels tell us where in the feeding relationships a certain organism is, and that has ecological consequences. Certain organisms can be at different trophic levels depending on which ecosystem they're in, because some organisms occupy more than one ecosystem. And depending on what ecosystem you're in, or even within one ecosystem, an organism can have a variety of ecological feeding relationships. So they can be both prey and the predator in the case of a consumer, and depending on what the organism is, one organism will eat it and another organism will also eat that. So some have multiple organisms feeding upon it. Some organisms have only one predator, for example, that's feeding upon it. Some organisms have multiple food items that they feed on at one time, and some organisms specialize in just one kind of food item in an ecosystem. So feeding relationships can get quite complex, and when they get complex, we have to use a food web to show those relationships. This is an example of a food web here, and it's a little bit different than a food chain. The food chain was very linear, one organism eating another and another eating that same organism. But in this case, it's a little bit complex, so you have to draw the arrows to show which organisms are feeding upon which other organisms, and again, those relationships can be quite complex in most ecosystems. So let's summarize what we learned in our video today, or what I hope you learned. The first thing is that producers can also be called autotrophs, and those are organisms that get their energy from non-living sources, either the sun or chemicals. The second thing is that producers, again, can be both photosynthetic and chemosynthetic. Our consumers in our ecosystems are also called heterotrophs. That's a new vocabulary word for you, I think. And those are organisms that get their energy by feeding on other organisms. And again, we're familiar with most animals being those heterotrophic animals. Also, we discussed trophic levels help describe the order in which organisms get their nourishment in the food chain. They're either a producer, a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, or in some cases, in some ecosystems, you have one or more tertiary consumers. And so those relationships get a little bit complex. And finally, when we try to represent those complex food relationships within an ecosystem, we can't use a food chain necessarily, so we have to use a diagram that we would call a food web. So there are concepts from chapters 13.3 and 13.4 in your textbook. Make sure you fill out the form and submit that for homework. And I'll see you in the next tutorial video.